Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's episode of Transatlantic Currents, Good Trouble, Advancing Voter Rights Protections, Rule of Law and Policy Reform in the United States. My name is Anna Grund, and I'm currently a visiting senior research fellow at the Center on US Politics and Power at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And it's my privilege to open this episode of Transatlantic Currents, which will discuss efforts to combat systemic racism, especially as it affects voting rights, the rule of law and policing with Nicole Austin Hillary. The efforts to address voting rights in Congress to balance the state-level actions have been stalled despite the Democratic majority in Congress and President Biden's commitment to deliver racial justice, as mentioned in his inaugural speech. The forthcoming midterm elections may also complicate the picture for the Biden administration to advance its own domestic agenda in the latter part of his presidency. I look forward to hearing Ms. Austin Hillary's expertise views on these issues as considered today. Leo Michel, a non-resident fellow at FIIA, will be chairing this event today, but before giving the floor to Leo to introduce our speaker, I would like to remind the audience to use the chat functions to impose the questions. Please, Leo, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anna. And Nicole Austin Hillary, welcome back to FIIA.
Thank you.
On the eve of the 2016 American elections, you addressed the FIIA conference. You were in Helsinki. We did not ask you at the time to predict the winner of the presidential election. And if my memory is correct, you did not offer a prediction. Instead, we wanted your perspective on some of the social justice issues that would challenge the new administration, whether led by Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And in retrospect, I must say you were very prescient. You identified the need to protect voting rights, the need to reform policing and the criminal justice system, and the need to reduce the role of money in US politics. And you explained how and why systemic failures in all of these areas have particularly harmful effects on the African American and other minority communities. As Anna mentioned, unlike his predecessor, President Biden, from his first day in office nearly 15 months ago, stated his commitment to deliver racial justice and combat systemic racism in various parts of American society and institutions. So we've invited you back to learn what's gone right in the past 15 months, what has not, and why, and maybe to have a better idea on what to expect in the months and years ahead. So welcome back, and I would ask you first if you would briefly describe the role and the mission of the Congressional Black Congress Foundation, which you now head, and how it relates to the Congressional Black Caucus.
Well, first of all, Leo, thank you so much for this invitation and for having me with you all today. It's quite an honor and a privilege, and it's wonderful to be back with you to have what I think are very critically important conversations. The one we had several years ago was equally important, and I always think it's good to be able to assess where we were, where we are, and how we should look forward. I am now in the role of President and CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. The Congressional Black Caucus Foundation was founded in 1976, and it is an organization that is focused on educating, creating a leadership pipeline, and producing critical and relevant policy tools, all with the focus of empowering Black America and the transglobal Black community. And we do this through myriad ways. We have a leadership institute that truly serves as a pipeline to produce the next generation of young Black leadership in the United States and beyond. The people who are who participate in our internship and fellowship programs are placed in congressional offices. They are placed in C-suite offices throughout corporate America, as well as with other government agencies. Our fellows are individuals who produce intellectual scholarship around myriad issues dealing with racial justice, dealing with voting rights, dealing with economic issues, poverty, inequality, and the like. And those are papers and documents and briefings that we produce so that not only the country, but the world has a repository of information where they can go to when they want to learn more about what are the issues affecting Black America. And the foundation, of course, is affiliated with the Congressional Black Caucus. Although we are separate entities, the foundation is a separate nonprofit organization here in the United States. But the members of Congress, the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, are integrated with us in that we support those members. Our policy work is information that they can use in their toolbox. We also work with the members to ensure we are engaged in thought leadership. For instance, every year we put together a huge event in Washington. It's known nationally. It's called the Annual Legislative Conference of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Incorporated, where members engage in workshops and brain trusts, if you will, and members of the public come and they join us, and we have discussions and we talk about next steps and recommendations for policy reform and for ways to reinvigorate and support and empower our communities. So it really is, in many ways, Leo, part think tank, part leadership development organization, as well as an organization that is working intersectionally with members of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation to ensure that we are giving the nation information and resources that it needs when it comes to how do we empower, sustain, and grow Black America.
Is the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and the Black Caucus itself, are they nonpartisan? Are they nonpartisan in reality as well as in principle?
Well, the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Incorporated is a nonpartisan organization. We have no affiliation with any parties in the United States. Our role and our focus is to look at the issues, whether those are issues that are more relevant in conservative circles versus liberal circles. That is not our focus. Our focus is on what are the issues that are of concern to Black America? What are the issues that are of concern when it comes to growing leadership? And that's how we focus our work. Now, the Congressional Black Caucus, those are officially elected members of the United States Congress. And those individuals, like other individuals who run for political office in the United States, do have party affiliations. Some are independent, of course, but the majority of them are affiliated with one of the national parties in the United States. And of course, their work and their focus is guided by their relationships to their parties, but that is completely separate. The foundation does not get engaged in that. We work with the members again to provide information, to serve as a resource. And because the foundation was really founded because the members realized in 1976, Leo, that there needed to be an organization that was going to be focused on empowering and engaging and providing resources for Black America, and also that there needed to be a foundation that was focused on how do we grow leadership and how do we grow leadership when it comes to the halls, the power halls of the United States. How do we grow leadership so that there are more Congress people, more senators, more state legislators, more state judges and other advocates to do the work and to focus on the needs of Black America. So that's where the intersection exists, Leo.
Okay. Very, very helpful, very important clarification. Let's start our look at some of these issues with some positive news, really. And that's last week, the Senate did confirm President Biden's nomination of Judge Katanji Brown Jackson, who will become now, in a few months, the first female African-American justice and the first former public defender in the 232-year history of the Supreme Court. In her opening remarks before the Senate committee that was considering her nomination, she stated that she had dedicated her career to, and let me quote her, to ensuring that the words engraved on the front of the Supreme Court building, which are equal justice under law, are a reality and not just an ideal. However, I and Americans saw that despite her impressive credentials, experience, and support from really a broad spectrum of the nation's legal and law enforcement communities, she was subjected to some very disingenuous and indeed sometimes disrespectful treatment by a number of the Republican senators on that committee. But I want to look ahead a little bit. I mean, you're free to comment on that, but looking ahead, I'd like to ask you, how do you think her presence on the court can help move the country closer to the equal justice under law ideal, especially since conservatives are going to maintain, possibly for decades to come, a majority on the court? And right now, it's a 6-3 majority on the court.
Well, Leo, I'm so glad this was the first question you started with, because I think it is important from an historical perspective to really acknowledge this moment here in the United States and frankly for the world, where the descendant of African slaves, a female descendant of African slaves, is going to be ascending to the United States Supreme Court. It's something that so many African Americans, frankly, Leo, didn't think they would see in their lifetimes. Very similar to many who would say they never thought they would see an African American president in the United States or an African American female vice president. So too were there similar sentiments shared about Judge Katanji Brown Jackson. But so many of us are elated. And when I say us, I don't just mean the Black community in the United States. We who believe in justice, we who believe in equity and fairness and opportunity for all, regardless of race, creed, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religious background. This is a victory for all who believe in that panoply of equity, Leo. So it is a moment to be celebrated. And you are right, she is going to be the first jurist on the Supreme Court to have a background in what I would call a traditional legal public interest area. So many of the justices have had different experiences, but someone who has served as an attorney, working on behalf of the poor, on behalf of the disenfranchised, on behalf of those who, but for public defender systems throughout the United States, would not have good legal counsel. She is the first to come to the court with that perspective. Now, despite the fact that the court is, as you say, Leo, going to maintain for decades to come, certainly past my lifetime, it is likely that it will be a mostly conservative court. But here's the important point that everyone needs to remember. When you have diverse backgrounds, experiences, and voices that are on the court, they have an opportunity to not only impact and influence their fellow jurists, they have an opportunity to impact and influence the country. Because even if the decisions do not necessarily go the way of those minority members, they have opportunities to use the bully pulpit, if you will, that they have as members of the Supreme Court. We know famously, for example, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in some very key decisions, some dealing with voting rights, some dealing with gender rights and gender equity. She used her stature and her position as a member of the Supreme Court to offer very, very stern and critically important dissenting opinions. This is an opportunity that Judge Katanji Brown Jackson will have. And often, Leah, what we find is that the dissenting opinions in some of those cases are really the parts of those cases that carry on throughout history, that are oft quoted, that are oft referenced, and that are often used as the foundation for future cases upon which lawyers will rely. So she will have an amazing opportunity and a very important opportunity to use her background, her intellect, her experience to, again, not only influence her fellow jurists, and we know this can happen, but to also influence the country and the way the rest of the country not only thinks, but how they see their fellow Americans, how they can better understand experiences of people who are different. And the last example I'll use to underscore this point, Leo, in terms of her ability to influence the other jurists is I'll note former Supreme Court Justice and Chief Justice Earl Warren. When Earl Warren was appointed to the court, it was assumed he was going to be a very conservative justice. But Earl Warren was the Chief Justice who ensured that the Brown versus Board of Education decision was ruled upon favorably, which helped to end segregation as we knew it in the United States. So jurists, regardless of their thinking, their intellectual background, have an opportunity to make a difference on the court and to change the course of history. And I think that's what we will see her do.
I'd also be interested in your views on a broader question of racial disparities in the federal judiciary. I'm thinking of an article I read recently that said that less than 2% of the 3,800 persons who have ever served as federal judges in the US have been Black women. Biden is trying to change that. In the past 15 months, according to what I've read, 1/4 of his appointments to federal judgeships have gone to Black women, which is apparently a far higher percentage than any other president, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Why is this important, this level of Black representation, and particularly Black women's participation on the other two levels of the federal judiciary, the district level and the appeals level?
One thing that people need to understand is this. Although the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land in the United States, the majority of cases that are heard at the lower court levels. The majority of decisions that will impact people's lives are decisions that are rendered at the lower court levels. So if we fail to have a diverse judiciary at the district court level and at the appellate court level, that means that decisions are being made that will impact people's lives, that will impact people's families, people's economic standings, and those decisions will be made by jurists who don't necessarily have an understanding of the lives and experiences of the majority of Americans. That is a problem. That is why, Leo, it is so vitally important to have a diverse judiciary. And when we talk about diversity in the judiciary, it has to span the spectrum. It has to include racial diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, sexual orientation diversity, because all of these different experiences speak to how people in this country live their daily lives. And if you have individuals who really only have a myopic view of what life in the United States is like, then we are limiting our ability to really touch people where we should. We are limiting our ability to offer empathy and understanding to the variety of life experiences that exist here in the United States. And let me also add this, Leo, because it's not just about the numbers in the lower courts. We have to really go back to where do we have to start making a difference? And that's where an organization like the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation comes in. We have to ensure that the pipeline of judges that are available is diverse. That means we have to ensure that the educational systems in the United States are ones that are equitable, that provide opportunity to as many young people as possible. We have to ensure that internships and fellowships and scholarship monies so that young people can matriculate through undergraduate, so that we can ensure that young people can matriculate through law school, that those foundational opportunities are put in place. Because if we are not ensuring that those things happen and that we are supporting them at those levels, then we are going to have a crisis on our hands. We are going to have a crisis in that we will not have a diverse set of candidates from which we can even choose to ensure that our courts are diverse. And so that's where an organization like the Congressional Black Caucus works very closely in terms of making certain that the pipeline is full and that we have young people ready to step into those positions, so that a President Joe Biden actually has a set of diverse candidates from which he can choose to ensure that our courts are fully filled with people who have varying experiences, varying viewpoints, and can, again, help ensure that any individual who comes before the court has someone in front of them who can at least put themselves in their shoes and who can have an open mind in terms of understanding what circumstances may have brought that particular individual in front of the court in the first place.
Well, putting this also back into the context of what we saw in the recent fight and some of the behaviors that we saw in the Senate concerning the confirmation process for Judge Jackson, it does seem to me it reflects the broader polarization of politics and the so-called culture wars in the U.S. And we're seeing also these conflicts play out in the area of voting rights. And I'd like to turn to that next. We saw in the wake of the 2020 presidential election and the January 6th insurrection, that is the violent attack on Congress, the former president and his supporters have continued to repeat the false claim that his defeat was due to massive fraud. Looking once again at the statistics on this, during 2021, 19 Republican-controlled states passed 34 different laws restricting access to voting, and apparently this trend is continuing into 2022. I read recently where one civil rights group described this as the most significant legislative assault on voting rights since the so-called Reconstruction period following the Civil War. And in many cases, these restrictions seem intended, at least in part, to reduce voting by Black Americans and other minorities. So I'd like you to take some time to give us a couple of examples of how this takes place. The state of Georgia appears to be a particularly interesting case, but there have been other manifestations of this in a number of red states, states where there are majority Republican control of the state legislature or the governor's house, or sometimes both.
You know, Leo, I think it's important to step back. We're gonna engage in a little history lesson, if you will, because I think it's impossible to understand what is going on in the United States right now with respect to voting rights without understanding some of the historical context behind it. In 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed and signed into law by former President Lyndon Johnson, that was done because this was a nation where the percentage of Black voters was abysmal. And that percentage was abysmal because in so many communities throughout the United States, particularly in southern states at that time, Black Americans were terrorized. They were terrorized to keep them not only from voting, but from even going to their local voting administration offices to register to vote. Black Americans lost their lives behind attempting to even register to vote. The summer of 1964, Freedom Summer, was a summer where young college students and activists went throughout the South to try to increase the number of Black Americans who were registered to vote. And in the course of that summer, people lost their lives. Civil rights activists Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were killed because they were on the ground trying to get Black community members to register to vote. So it's important that people understand that is the history behind the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Former US Congressman, the late, great John Lewis, helped to lead a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama to fight for voting rights. And he and his colleagues were beat. They were beaten and bludgeoned by Alabama state troopers because they were simply trying to give people the opportunity to register and to vote, which is a right in the United States. It is a right that so many of us who work on voting rights issues believe is inherent in the Constitution. Even if the words are not specifically there, we believe via the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, it is an inherent right. So that is the history. And so the fight for voting rights stems from that. And the fight to protect the right to vote as a precious right stems from that history. But in 2013, the US Supreme Court ruled in a case, Shelby County versus Holder, that many of the protections that were put in place by the Voting Rights Act had to be abolished. And one of those key rights was, one of those key tools of the Voting Rights Act was that states and jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination in voting had to have any changes to their state voting laws pre-cleared by the US Department of Justice or the appellate court in the District of Columbia. The Shelby County decision removed that requirement. It removed the requirement of notice of changes. So what used to happen under the Voting Rights Act is if a state, again, that was covered by the Voting Rights Act, and again, it was those states and jurisdictions that had a history of voter discrimination, those states, before they could even think, Leo, about making a change to any of their voting laws, whether that was moving a polling place, whether that was changing the time that an election would begin, they had to have all of those changes pre-cleared, and they had to notify the public that they were going to do that. That provision was removed. So then what we saw was a groundswell of state legislatures then putting new laws in place that basically had the effect of making it harder for people to vote. Not just Black people, brown people, poor people, elderly people, students, those groups, Leo, who historically have had a more difficult time engaging in our electoral process. It was those groups that suffered a disparate impact from these changes. And it has not stopped, Leo. In fact, you cited some of the statistics, probably relying on, and I would suggest that people do the same, probably relying on information from my former organization, the Brennan Center for Justice, where they track and look at what has been the impact of these changes since the Shelby County decision. How many new laws are being impacted in states? How many new pieces of legislation are being introduced in state legislatures? And there's a groundswell of effort, Leo. And so what we are seeing is that there are new and larger and frankly more vicious attacks on the right to vote in the United States. And people need to understand this. There are efforts on the federal level to help protect voting rights, but the federal government is limited in how much it can do because the way the United States is set up from a legal perspective is states run local elections. So that is why you will hear stories in the United States about the secretaries of states. Every secretary of state is, if you will, the chief officer overseeing voting and elections in that particular state. So what we really have, Leo, is a patchwork quilt of laws throughout the United States. Now, the federal government certainly does have power, and the opportunity the federal government has is to put laws in place that deal with federal elections. So in that regard, there is a lot that the federal government can do to ensure equal access to the polls and voter protection by enacting legislation that would offer protection for the federal on the federal level. That's what the Voting Rights Act did, Leo. And that's why there's a strong push right now by many advocates to ensure that those protections not only are returned, but that stronger and more effective protections are put in place. And we at the CBCF are certainly supporting that and doing research around that and are talking and engaging with communities about how they can be more empowered to push for those changes too. And one of the good things, Leo, and then I'll stop because I know you have other questions, but there's so much richness here. When you talk about voting rights, there's so much there to talk about. But I do want to say this. One of the good things that has happened, because I always think it's important for people to not only hear about the problems, but to hear about some of the good things that have happened. One of the good things, Leo, that has happened is that we have seen the level of citizen activism increase exponentially since the 2013 Shelby County decision, because voters have been educated about what the results of that decision mean for them, and they have learned that the power to create change and the power to educate their communities about elections resides in each of them individually. So we have seen a groundswell of community activism, grassroots activism throughout the country. And we've seen a groundswell of people just becoming more knowledgeable about the elections process and about voting rights, and really working with other community members to ensure that they can do all that they can to continue to protect and hopefully advance voter protection in the United States.
So as one specific example, it just seems to me quite ironic that in Georgia, where you had a state with a Republican governor, Republican Secretary of State, and team administering the election, they actually pushed back during the vote counting for the November 2020 presidential election. They pushed back against very direct, including by the then president, attempts to intimidate them and force them, in effect, to change the vote, to make up a vote so that he would win the election instead of, in Georgia and in other states as well, instead of President Biden. They pushed back against that, and yet they've gone ahead now, and some of those same Republican officials are now defending this new law that was passed in the state of Georgia last year that would do things like reduce the number of voting areas, locations, the ability to put in absentee ballots, which is very important, particularly important for some of the minority communities, even criminalize passing out water and food to voters in line. So it seems ironic, and now, whereas you said there's been legislation in Congress to, at least where federal elections are concerned, to try to get more protections in there. They passed the House of Representatives, but now they've been blocked in the Senate. And even 2 Democratic senators have refused to change or create an exception to the filibuster rule, which is not in the Constitution. It's simply a rule that the Senate can change. They've, in effect, allowed a minority in the Senate to block progress, block even a vote on that legislation. So it ends up being, yes, there are efforts to fight back in the courts and so forth, but it seems like a pretty dismal outlook where there are so many efforts to block voting and very few successful efforts, it seems, to push back.
Leo, you packed a lot in there. So yeah. let's pull it apart a little bit, piece by piece. First of all, people need to understand what we mean when we talk about the filibuster. The filibuster is a mechanism that allows for ongoing debate in Congress, and it's really historically been used with no time limits, and it's historically been used to block the forward movement and eventual passage of certain pieces of legislation. And historically in the United States, most famously, it was used by Southern white Democrats in the 1960s to try to block passage of the Voting Rights Act. and other legislation that focused on providing equal opportunity and ending segregation in the United States. The problem that we now have, Leo, is simply this, that we have politicians who, even though they are elected to represent their constituents and the needs and desires of their communities, we have reached a point in the US democracy where many politicians are focused on the politics of their jobs and not on the purpose of their jobs, which is to be a voice for their communities. And that's why we see the polarization that we have seen over the last several years, Leo, because that focus, that commitment has been lost. And we are going to have to find a way to get back to that. We are going to have to find a way to try to tear down those walls of division, those walls of misunderstanding, because it frankly is stymieing our democracy's progress. And it's making it difficult for us to do what the American people want their elected officials in Washington to do, which is to make their lives better, to help them to take better care of their families and to help them have better communities. Now, the big question is, Leo, how are we going to do that? I think one of the ways that we're going to do that is, number one, that the public is going to have to start making different decisions about whom they send to Washington to represent them. The power is in the communities. The power is in each individual voting American to make a difference. That's where it has to start. That's number one. Number two, it also has to deal with those members themselves becoming better listeners and better communicators and people who frankly are more empathetic and listening to one another. You know, I will tell you, Leo, I remember I was at an event in Washington. This was several years ago, and I was on a panel discussion at the Library of Congress here in Washington. And former late Senator Robert Dole was also a panelist at this event. And I recall him talking about the dysfunction in Washington and the failure to get things done. And one of the things he said, and it stuck with me, is that during his time in the US Senate, he said members were not afraid to listen to one another. Members had respect for one another, even if they had differing opinions, even if they came from different parties. They were not afraid to debate, to listen, and to be open to changing their opinions. They were not closed to being open to thinking of different solutions to solving our nation's problems. That's the other thing that's going to have to happen. It is going to have to be those kinds of statespersons with that kind of thinking who begin to sway and really step up in terms of leading and serving as examples to other members of Congress to say we've got to do something differently because we are not serving the citizens of the United States in the way that we need to. That's also going to happen. And the third thing that's going to happen, Leo, is that we're going to have to see more courageous leadership. When you mentioned that, there have been at least 2 Democrats who have been taking positions that are counter to what their party believes is in the best interest of their constituents, that can be a problem for the parties. It's going to take courage for people to stand up in both parties, in both of the major parties in the United States, to call out when something wrong is being done, to call out when politics is getting in the way of caring and making the best decisions for the public. It's going to require that. You're probably familiar, Leo, I know you are, with the Profiles in Courage awards that are given out by the Kennedy family and the Kennedy Library in Boston. I think of those awards often because it recognizes leaders who sometimes do what's not popular, but who do what is right. We're going to have to see more of that in Washington, doing what is right, not what is politically expedient, not what is politically beneficial to you as an individual elected leader, but what is beneficial to the community and to the country and therefore to the democracy.
I want to open this up in just a few minutes to audience questions, but before I do, I do want to ask you to touch on the third topic. George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020, and this was followed by widespread and mostly peaceful protests in the United States, but also globally, because it was in many ways the culmination of decades of frustration and pain resulting from the death and often brutality exacted upon the Black and Brown community by law enforcement in this country. And it's hard to deny those facts. The House of Representatives acted pretty quickly to pass a Justice and Policing Act with some important reforms to policies and practices that would affect state and local police forces, restricting the use of certain policing practices and the use of force in certain conditions. But all of that over the course of a year seems to basically have stalled. And Senator Cory Booker, who represented the Democratic side on the discussions on this in the Senate, basically, it seems to me, threw up his hands last September, or perhaps it was October, saying we can't move forward. What does that say about the ability on such a pressing issue or rather the inability of Congress to roll up its sleeves and get things done? And although there's been some progress here or there in some prosecution of police officers that have not conducted themselves properly or committed murder in the case of George Floyd, there really doesn't seem to be a national effort underway, or perhaps it's there and I haven't seen it. So I'll just ask for your reaction to these and what can be done in the future.
Well, what you really underscored, Leo, is that we have a lot of work that still must be done. No gains that have been accomplished in the history of the United States when it comes to race and justice, which to me are both inextricably linked, race and justice. None of those gains were quickly won, Leo. They were part of long, strategic, thoughtful processes, campaigns, and engagements to create change. So I am not deterred at all, Leo. And I say that to you with a straight face. I am not deterred at all. You know, I was a history major in college. I believe in history, and I believe in the lessons that we learn from history. If we go back, throughout the history of this country, we see that gains have not been easily won, but have been eventually won because of tenacity, because of perseverance, because of courageous leaders. And I think that's what we will see manifest here in the United States. Look, the death of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor, the death of Ahmaud Arbery, of Sandra Bland, and I could go on and on. We could be here for the rest of the day, Leo, listing those names. Those deaths changed the country and they changed the world. We have had a reawakening. It's like Pandora's box, Leo. You can't put it back. And we can't go back, and we won't go back. What we've seen, and this relates to a comment I made to you earlier about voting and the effect of all of these attacks on voting rights has really resulted in people in the communities and in the streets and at the grassroots level becoming more focused, becoming more engaged, and becoming more energized around those issues. That's what we've seen following these deaths. That's what we've seen throughout the world it wasn't just in the United States, the whole world coalesced around this idea of racial justice being something that we have to achieve globally, not just in the United States, but globally. The whole world coalesced around this understanding that there is systemic racism built into the ways in which many nations work and operate. That systemic racism that deals with economics, that deals with power dynamics. The world has been awakened to that, Leo, and we will not turn back. And I will tell you that, again, there will be and continue to be a steady stream of leadership that's going to push forward. The members of the Congressional Black Caucus are at the forefront of this, and Senator Cory Booker is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. They are working tirelessly to ensure that those names are not forgotten and that we continue to push forward on legislative efforts. But what they're also doing, Leo, is working back in their districts and in the communities. Because again, as I said about voting rights, it's going to take a bifurcated effort, Leo. It's not just what will the federal government do and what can it do? It's also what can leaders throughout the spectrum of leadership in the United States do? What can local mayors do? What can local city councils do? What can township councils do? What can state senators and state legislators do? It's going to take a panoply of efforts in order for us to see change. And that's what we are seeing around the country. And I'll leave you with this. In just a week and a half, we at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation are going to be on the ground in Detroit with one of our CBC members from Michigan. And we're going to have a community conversation with the Black community and other interested community members to talk about what is happening in your city. What can we do? How can our research help? How can the members work with you and help? How can we stand side by side with you to create change in your communities? That's what we've seen as an outgrowth and an outcome of those horribly, horrific deaths, Leo. And that is what is going to, I think, eventually propel and compel the leaders at the highest levels of this nation to behave differently and do something differently. Because I think we're going to see that the community is just not going to stand for less. And that's how we historically have seen change in the United States. That's how we historically have seen changes to our democracy.
Thank you. Anna, let's, back in Helsinki, let's go back to you and ask you, I know you've been looking at collecting some of the questions that have been submitted on the chat.
Yes, thank you, Nicole and Leo. Just a very fascinating discussion to follow on. Please, if you have any questions, you can put them on the chat, and I think I will use my privilege to ask the first question, if that's okay to you, Nicole. I was wondering, I have this raised plenty of questions. In my own research, I have focused on US Congress and politics in there. But I was wondering, you spoke a lot about the grassroots actions and communities and so on, but also like that there are some negative examples at the state level about making things like Voting Rights Act or voting related issues more harder, referring, for example, to the election integrity. But there must be other opposite examples, like positive examples. So could you mention some examples of what states we should be following if we want to see some kind of advanced issues in related to these issues? And also the other question I had in mind is that in Congress, it's in two-party system, it very often kind of relates to the fact that certain political questions become very polarized or politicized rather easily. But the overall view of the Americans is not necessarily that polarized or that politicized. So how you could combine these two different realities, if you can say that. So what are the ways to combine these different attitudes towards certain political questions? Is it that just the communities, or how to kind of bring these two different realities together more? As you mentioned, there are state level actions and then there are federal level actions, but is there a way to combine these? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Anna. And I'm so glad you asked the first question. And I tried to weave that in a little bit when Leo and I were talking, because I always want people to focus on the good news. It is not all bad. And what we also have to realize is that from difficulties, what often manifests itself are wonderful opportunities and examples of people coming together and really achieving parity and equity and working on equitable access. So I will give you two examples. One, and this is happening in the state of California, and it's not necessarily about voting, but I think it's important for people to understand this. The issue, as we talk about systemic racism in the United States and the issue of racial justice, one of the topics that has really risen to the top is the issue of reparations and reparative justice. The concept of how do you make communities whole that have historically suffered disparately because of that systemic racism. And the issue of reparative justice here in the United States, that discussion is focused on the descendants of African slaves and how the history of slavery, how it has impacted the Black community and caused communities to have less access when it comes to economic access, education, fair and equitable housing, et cetera. In the state of California, they have put together a commission that's going to be studying the issue of reparations and looking at what can we do in communities to ensure that we are making the descendants of African slaves whole again. And they're looking at myriad options. They are looking at, can we perhaps provide funding so that individuals can have college educations paid for, because we know that historically, because of the impacts of slavery and systemic racism, that many African Americans have been foreclosed to opportunities to gain a college degree and graduate degrees. They're looking at in Evanston, Illinois, is another example where they're working on issues of reparations, and they have been looking at making changes or codifying changes in their city codes to look at housing specifically. How can we create more equitable housing because of the systemic racism that has existed in Evanston, Illinois as a result of slavery and land changes and land grabs and housing being taken away from African American communities. Those are two wonderful examples. In the state of Maryland, for example, their state legislature has been working on efforts to expand access to voting by expanding numbers of polling places, by expanding voting hours, by ensuring that they are increasing early voting opportunities. So there are myriad examples dealing with voting, dealing with how do we attack systemic racism that are happening throughout the United States, Anna. And again, they're happening on the community level. I think that is going to be when history is told about this particular segment in our world. This is what's going to rise to the top. And then related to your second question. When you talk about a coming together, when we have this polarization and how do we have a coming together, I think it is the examples of humanity, Anna, that I think really underscore how we're going to come together as a nation. And I'll give you an example just from yesterday's news here in the United States. Yesterday in the United States in Brooklyn, there was an individual who opened fire on a subway platform in the borough of Brooklyn, in the city of New York. When that happened, what we saw were individuals who didn't ask, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Do you believe in reparations or don't you? Did you vote for Donald Trump or did you vote for Hillary Clinton? All of those questions dissipated, and what we saw were people rolling up their sleeves, coming together and saying, I have to help my fellow human. I have to help my fellow Brooklynite, my neighbor. And I use that as an example, Anna, because I think when it comes down to what really matters most to people in this country, it is how do we treat each other as human beings? How do we engage with our neighbors? How do we ensure that we are protecting our lives, our children's lives? That, I think, is the good news that still exists, and I think is going to help to really tear down the walls of polarization here in the United States. At people's core, at their basic core, it is, am I able to protect my family? Am I able to keep my family safe? Am I able to feed my family, house my family, clothe my family, educate my children, and provide safe opportunities for my family and my neighbors? Those are the overarching questions that I think are of most concern to people here in the United States. And I think what we're going to see is the humanistic side of people that's really going to be at the forefront, that's going to help to break down those walls of polarization.
Thank you so much. There is a question in the chat also about the Republican Party stance on these issues that we are discussing today, and how it is influenced by the pundits like Fox Media personalities. Would you like to comment on that shortly, or?
Well, I will say this. I am not an expert on Fox News and how they do business and their commentators, so I will leave that to the side. What I will say is this, that I think the Republican Party has some work to do in terms of how they are presenting themselves and their positions to the United States, and you see that within the party itself. There are divisions within that party. There are some people in that party who feel that they have gotten away from what their historical purpose and focus has been. There are some who believe that the party is less focused on its original principles and more focused on politics and sound bites. And again, there are similar criticisms for the Democratic Party. There are similar criticisms for the Green Party. I think that what these party leaders have to do in all parties is to do some soul searching and to figure out, are we representing the values and the principles upon which our parties were founded? And again, that's something that I think is critically important as we talk about polarization in the United States, as we talk about how we're going to sustain and grow our democracy. Those are questions that I think all of the parties have to ask themselves, not just one party, because what we see happening is not just about one party. What we see happening is it is a cacophony of interests and changes throughout the political systems that exist in the United States. And so I think some soul searching is going to be done across the board.
Yes, thank you. At the moment, I do not have any further questions in the chat, and I think we are running out of time. But Leo, do you want to say something?
Yes.
At this point? Thank you.
And just, I wanted to thank you for this, and you've kept the conversation not only at a philosophical level, but I think a very practical one, and on balance, an optimistic one. Recognizing the challenges, the political and long time social challenges that still exist in the United States. It's an important conversation, and perhaps we should have said this at the outset. We recognize that given the situation in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, that tragic humanitarian situation with all of the political and economic consequences, it really takes a lot of oxygen out of the room. But in this series of transatlantic currents, we've felt it was important also to make time to look at domestic issues in the United States that really vitally affect the conduct of our institutions, its democratic values, and American society, because ultimately they do have an effect on American foreign policy, on defense policy, and our ability in that way also to contribute to security and stability and democracy in Europe, in Finland, and beyond. So it's an important conversation for the Finnish and for the broader European audience as well, many of whom will listen to you via the YouTube channel and in other social network channels where this will be posted. So thank you again, Nicole, Austin, Hillary. And perhaps we'll find an occasion to invite you back or to get you back to Helsinki in the coming years to help us keep track of the progress that hopefully will be made in the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leo. And thank you for reminding us all that it is really about the human race and not just individual races, individual groups, or individual nations. It is about the human race. And that's why these kinds of conversations are so critically important. And I'm grateful to you and the Institute for hosting them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will close the session now. Thank you for the audience as well.